Hi, I'm Jorge. I'm a postdoc at the Joslin Diabetes Center, Harvard Medical School.
I'm Erin. I'm a postdoc at Boston University.
Hi, I'm Juan Pablo, and I am a postdoc at UW-Madison. So we can, I guess, go on and talk a little bit about how we got interested in these topics, these spaces, sort of the work that we're involved in. For me, there's a very clear point, and it's my PhD. I've always had and been privileged enough to have good experiences in my labs and with my mentors. But I was in a position where the labs that were surrounding us, sort of geographically and just physically within the same floor, there were some managers there, or PIs I should say, who weren't really good managers, and they were more on the egregious side of behaviors. Sort of there was a lot of bullying and harassment going on, and I think what blew my mind for the most part is that there are a lot of places, institutes and departments in particular, where people turned a blind eye to these things. Like everyone knew that these professors were like having students that were leaving, right? Altogether, they were like, not just academia, but they were like, I just don't want to do any kind of science whatsoever because of this terrible experience that I've had at the hands of this person who's meant to be training me. And for me, just the idea that in some places the systems and the culture are still set up to ignore that type of behavior really blew my mind, and it just made me really interested in starting to engage in conversations that other people were having as to what they thought the problems were, but also what they thought some of the solutions were, and how to solve some of these issues, particularly around the axes of identity, but also just training in general.
Yeah, where we're thinking about my own identity became really important for me was also during my PhD. So I was the only female in my lab group. My PhD, or my supervisor was male, and the other grad students were male, and we all work internationally. So I study primates, I work in West Africa, and I realized that I was having a really different field experience than my male colleagues in terms of just like general sexual harassment and thinking about my safety, and it was taking up a lot of space in my mind, and it was really having an effect on how well I was able to do my research. Meanwhile, my male colleagues were like extending their time in the field because it was so great. And so it made me think about how I could have a conversation productively with my supervisor, and whether or not I felt like I could have a productive conversation. And now as a postdoc, I'm in an all-female lab, and there are still problems, but they're very different problems. And it's like the conversations that we have about fieldwork are really, really different.
Yeah. For me, it's been quite an interesting journey because I kind of almost felt that I was very multicultural and open just because I grew up in Southeast Mexico and most of my family is from Belize.
Okay.
So I kind of grew up between two countries.
Right.
And I felt that was kind of like my experience, and it was all great. And then I moved to the UK, as I mentioned before, and then I experienced a vast number of cultures there. And it was quite interesting that at the beginning it was new, it was fascinating to learn about all of these different things and how people were also very interesting in what I could bring to the table as a Mexican or as a Belizean. But then I felt like I needed as well a group of people that I was closely identified with. And then I found a group of friends that were Mexican as well. We kind of like joined a society, and we started having what we called our Mexican family Sunday lunches, just to like feel identified and speak the same language.
Yeah, and I mean, that brings up this whole dynamic of belonging, right? And creating spaces that are inclusive and at the same time aren't necessarily assimilating, right? Because I feel like the default a lot of times, and I'm not saying that this was your experience, but in general, in spaces where majority groups want to be inclusive of minority groups, there can be a tendency to fall into assimilation, right? And I mean, there's that whole aspect of privilege that goes into it too.
Yeah, I'm, pretty privileged along a variety of axes. When there are places that you don't feel represented, at least for me, I'm pretty secure in myself, and I generally feel supported in my environment, so I feel like it's okay for me to then be vocal about the things that people might be forgetting about, and my hope is that by being vocal about places where I might be marginalized or at least in the minority. It makes space for other people to feel like they can also start bringing more of themselves into the environment or the lab group.
And I think that's super important, Erin, because, for example, sometimes we kind of like forget that some people might not be interested in going to a pub or a bar for a discussion, like after work, about science. And then we are excluding those people that cannot come because they have children or other commitments, or they just
they don't drink.
Or they might be from a religion that doesn't allow them to go to these places. So we need to work around. And if you are vocal about it, then we can work to include you and to include everyone else.
And I think even if you're not vocal about it, by having conversations that recognize different parts of other people's identities, it gives you there doesn't have to be somebody Muslim in your group for you to be like, hey, maybe we should have some times where we go for coffee together. Or you don't have to have parents who are vocal about not being able to do something after work to think about meeting during the day, right? But once you start thinking about ways that you can make a space more inclusive for yourself, you can think about, making space so that other people would have the ability to fully participate.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that brings in shifting it from the other lens, right? You mentioned you as someone in a space where you don't feel represented, you bring that identity so that others might create more inclusive spaces. But as postdocs, we are moving into, whether we stay in academic positions or go into other positions, other careers, we're going to be moving into leadership roles where we create spaces and are leaders for other people. And so then the question becomes, from the other side, when we are in that position of leadership, when we are in the position of creating that space, how do we then include other people and create spaces where people, if we aren't already, being inclusive, how do we create a space that opens the door for us to say, you can bring your whole self, and we will be accommodating, and we will, change things around or, adjust where and if needed, because that's really important too.
And sometimes I think it doesn't require for you to be in that position that allows you leadership. You can just be a leader yourself. And it's very unlikely that if you feel this way, no one else will be feeling this way. So it's just finding the people and start making a society and talking about it, just having coffee over these types of conversations, and then suddenly you have a group of people, and it's not just you now. You have a safe space, hopefully, to talk about all of this, and suddenly other people start noticing, and they start also changing their behavior and their inclusiveness of you or your group. And I think we don't have to necessarily wait. We can act on it.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's even challenging a lot of the paradigms that we have about academic culture or what professionalism is in academia, right? Thinking where does that come from? And is that really helpful? Who does that help? Who does that hinder? Who does that exclude?